All right, so we're looking at day 4 here. So this is going to be chapter 5 of your NASM, right? So this is PowerPoint 4, which is chapter 5. So we're skipping one of the chapters in your textbook. We're skipping like the metabolism chapter, just because, like, as important as metabolism is, don't get me wrong, that's hugely important. It is not that important to the assessments class, right? Like, we're not really looking at metabolism from the perspective of understanding like what type of workout to give someone in terms of, through like assessments, right? Like, obviously metabolism is hugely important when it comes to like program design. You want to make sure you're targeting the right type of metabolism. If your goal is to burn a lot of calories, you want to kind of go into aerobic metabolism. If your goal is to develop strength, you want to stay in anaerobic metabolism. Obviously those are important, but they're not really part of the perspective when it comes to fitness assessments, right? We're not measuring, we're not understanding that to kind of pick exercise choices like overactive, underactive muscles or cardio or things like that. So today we're moving on to chapter 5, which is very important to understand when we look at fitness assessments, because this is our understanding of how the body moves. And if we are looking at alterations in the way someone moves their body, we can recognize like, oh, okay, ideally your knees should be lined up evenly while you're doing this exercise, but you're experiencing knee valgus. Your knees are caving in. And so you've got adduction, you've got internal rotation, right? And so you're going to look at both those things and go, okay, so if that's what's happening and I don't want that to happen, I need to write a program that does the exact opposite. So we need to focus on external rotation. We need to focus on abduction instead of adduction. And so that's where we kind of got to get into our terms here. Eugenia, I'm going to give you a special shout out again. This is one of our heaviest term PowerPoints. There are, in terms of terms, there in like with terminology, there are more vocabulary words in this lesson, I think, than any other PowerPoint that we've got. So
I see.
buckle down. You got this. Do you guys, it's so funny, like I always give these like first modder pep talks whenever I'm going through the first 5 days of class. We really do kind of hit you guys hard on your first five days. It's our way of kind of weeding out the week, I think. It's like if we can just keep them through these first 5 days, we know they're serious, So we are looking at human movement science today. And so purpose of this lesson is to understand the components of our human movement system. So we're going to look back at the muscular, nervous, and skeletal system. And then we're going to talk about how those three systems actually produce this movement, right? And then we're going to talk about how we've labeled those movements so that we, as like exercise professionals or health professionals or whatever you want to call us, can have a standard language to speak. And that way there's nothing left for interpretation, right? And that's really like the key thing that we're looking at here. The reason we have all this terminology is because that is what allows us to all speak this, talk the talk, There's nothing that's going to be left for interpretation. We're not going to say up, we're going to say superior, right? We're not going to say lift it out away from your body. We're going to say abduct, And that way, like nothing is ever up for interpretation. If I say something and you say something, we're on the same page together. So we want to be able to describe our biomechanical terminology, our planes of motion, joint actions, muscle actions, things like that. We also want to describe like how the certain influences act on the human movement system. So we'll look at a couple things that are not terminology today as well. We will also be looking a little bit at the idea of like how we have like motor behavior and proprioception, like how our brain sort of learns things. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of sensory information and how that all kind of comes together to relate to movement. I'm gonna fix my PowerPoint here really quick. It's doing the thing that I hate. I always forget how to change it. Hold on. Transitions, no. Layout? No, that's not it at all. Oh boy, hold on. Ugh, I always forget how to do this. Review. Sorry, guys. Just give me 1 second here to remember how to friggin' fix this. I don't want any transitions. Ever, 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 ever. Oh my gosh. It's down here. Oh no, come on. I really, really don't want to deal with this. I can't remember where to find it because I never remember where to find it. Uh, oh, that's not it. Oh my God. I lost my window. There you go. Oh my God. I can't, we can't spend any more time on this. You reset work? No, of course not. Oh, Nassim, you suck. All right. um, well, we'll just have to deal with it. That's lame. Okay. Um, so let's go ahead and take a look at our human movement system, right? So the human movement system, that's the muscular system, nervous system, and skeletal system all working together. It's got to be aware of its environment, right? Like it's got to be aware of its relationship to the environment, right? Internal and external, how it's, what position it's in and things like that, in order to be able to produce the appropriate response. Like without having an understanding of what its current status is, it isn't able to understand, how it's supposed to move in response to that current status, right? And so it has to gather the necessary information, and that's where we come back to talking about proprioception, right? We go all the way back to when we were talking about the nervous system. Proprioception is your body's sense of where it is in space, right? If you've got like there's more sense, they tell you in school that's like you get your five senses, you get sight, sound, touch, taste, and what's the last one? Oh, smell, right? But you've also got there's actually a lot of other senses, tons of them. And one of them is proprioception. That's the one that's sort of most important to us, right? Our understanding of where we are in space. And so having that proprioception is really important. So we as like a community study this, we study proprioception using what we call biomechanics, right? So biomechanics are the motions that the kinetic chain produces and the forces that are acting upon it, right? So when we're talking about biomechanics, which is what we're mostly talking about today, it is the study of how our body interacts with outside forces, right? So like if I talk about holding a 5-pound dumbbell like this versus holding a 5-pound dumbbell like this, it's going to feel very different because this dumbbell is actually very close to my shoulder right now. I mean, I know it's like in an L shape here, but if you look at like how many inches away it is this direction, right? That's not very far away. But if I go like this, it's very, very far away, right? And so now that lever is much longer. And so biomechanically, this is a less advantageous position than this if I'm trying to, lift as heavy as possible. Which is why we actually do lift like this, because we want to sort of, we're training. And so we train in an unadvantageous position. I was just kind of whining before the call started about how I find that I'm pretty bad at like a lot of calisthenics, and that's, it is, I got long freaking arms, and that is not mechanically advantageous to body weight exercises. It's a lot of longer levers that feel much heavier. So that is sort of what we need to understand when we look at like biomechanics, right? And so this is going to be important because when we are using biomechanic terminology, it allows for, again, the effective communication between us, right, as fitness professionals. So as we're looking at that, right, biomechanics, we've got to understand our anatomic locations, right? Our anatomic locations are points on the body. It's where we look at something and point to something on the body. And there's a couple key terms here. Sometimes these get a little confusing, especially when you get to like proximal and distal. Those are the two that usually screw people up. But for now, we're going to look at like the idea of superior. Superior is going to be a position above a point of reference. So when you're looking at the body, right? And actually, we haven't even, really quickly before we do our anatomic locations, one thing I want you guys to remember is that all of this terminology is always as if the body is in this position right here. So like this right here, the way I'm standing, this is referred to as the anatomic position, right? It is standing tall with toes pointed straight forward, hands at your sides, palms facing forward, okay? So that's the anatomic position. And whenever we are talking about like a position on the body, whether it's superior or inferior or lateral or medial, right? We are always referring to it from the anatomic position. So I'm talking about like where my head is if I were in the anatomic position. Now, if I were doing like a handstand, like if I were on my head standing like that, my head's the lowest part of my body, right? Well, other than my hands, right? But like my head's very, very low. That does not mean that my head is now inferior because my body position that I'm currently in doesn't matter. We are always referring to anatomic locations as if a person was standing like this. So my shoulder is superior, right? It's above my belly button. But if I go like this, and I bend over like this, right? Well, guess what? My shoulder is still superior to my belly button, right? Like it's totally the same because it doesn't matter what position you're in. It only matters where it's located on the body during the anatomic position, okay? And that's standing tall in this position right here. So anatomic position, anatomic terminology. So that is going to look just like this. And these are those terms that we're talking about, right? If we look at it here, you can see you have got like, you're going to, and you want to kind of draw like a little line in between the body down this way. You want to draw another line down the body this way, right? And so you have like, you know, this is your medial line. This is like your horizontal line, right? And so you have superior, which is above, inferior, which is below, right? And so you can see they're showing that here. Superior is up, inferior is down. Well, let's go through. I won't stay on that picture. Let's just go through them. So superior is a position above a point of reference. So, you know, my nose is superior to my mouth, but my eyebrows are superior to my nose, right? Anything that's above something else. The head is superior on the body. Inferior is a position below a point of reference. So your pelvis, right? Your pelvis is down below your rib cage. So your pelvis is inferior to the rib cage, right? My nose is inferior to my eyebrows. My mouth is inferior to my nose, right? So again, like that's how we go like straight up and down. And superior and inferior, they just go like this. They're kind of like an elevator going up and down. Then you've got anterior and you've got posterior. Anterior is on the front of the body and the posterior is on the back of the body, right? So like, you know, your pec muscles are on the anterior part of your body, but your shoulder blade is on the posterior part of your body, right? So anterior is on the front, posterior is on the back. Pectoral muscles are anterior to the rib cage, right? You know, your pec muscles lay on top of your ribs. So in that case, we would say that the pecs are anterior and the rib cage would be posterior to it, right? Posterior is a position, like I said, on the back. The scapula is posterior to the rib cage, right? Your rib cage wraps around your body, but your shoulder blade, that scapula, lays on top of it, right? And so that's further behind, therefore it is posterior, right? Your hamstrings are posterior, your quadriceps are anterior. And in the arms, you know, which generally kind of sit like this most of the time. Like a lot of times we stand with our palms facing us. Well, in the anatomic position, which is this, the biceps are anterior and the triceps are posterior. You've also got medial and lateral. Medial and lateral are going to move side to side. They're kind of like a moving sidewalk, right? And so medial is a position closer to the midline, right, of the body. And lateral is farther from the midline. So like if I look at medial and lateral, right? Medial is right along this middle line as it's drawn down the body here, and lateral is anything around the outside, right? So your breastbone, your sternum, right, that solid bone right here, that is the most medial part, right? That is medial. But then your pec muscles flank it on both sides, right? So those would be considered lateral compared to that, right? Or like if I move my arms out sideways, right, I'd be moving them laterally. Unless I added them back towards me, then I'd be moving them medially. So it only moves in a horizontal fashion, but like I said, the sternum is medial compared to the collarbone, right? Your sternum is right here, is this whole section right here, but then your collarbone runs this way. So in relation to that, your sternum is medial and your collarbone is lateral. Your eyes are more lateral compared to your nose, right? We got a few more. We have got, well, I forgot, this goes in a weird, I always forget this. The PowerPoint goes in a weird order. It does proximal and distal on the first page. The next two are called proximal and distal. These are a little bit odd, but proximal and distal are closest to the center of the body or closest to the point of reference, if there is a point of reference. So this one sometimes gets a little confusing, but you'll notice we draw proximal and distal at an angle. So remember, medial and lateral, they go like this. Superior and inferior, they go like this. Proximal and distal can go in any diagonal direction. So I always like to show people this. I always like to show people this on like paint here, right? But if you think of like, you've got like this line here, and you've got like this line here, right? So this is medial, right? It is moving only along like a horizontal line towards the center, right? Whereas this is lateral. Ugh. Writing is so difficult. I see like teachers do this on videos online, and they have like the freaking pen, and I'm like, I gotta get one of those pens. Then you've got superior, which would be going this way, right? And so that's superior. And then you've got inferior, which would be going, oh my God. All right, we'll redo that one. Inferior, which would be below, right? But then proximal and distal, they're moving towards this very center of both, right? Superior and inferior, they only go straight up and down. Medial and lateral, they only go side to side. Proximal and distal can go sideways. So we've got proximal, which is close. Actually, you know what? We'll do it on this side. We've got proximal, which is close to the midline, right? So that would be proximal, because it's within proximity, right? That's where that word's coming from. It's starting to get messy. And then you have distal, which would be farther away. So distal. There's some like teacher on YouTube right now who's like, you know, their skin is crawling. They're like, there's a disturbance in the force. So proximal is closer to the midline, distal is further away, right? I always like to think of it as kind of like a circle. So, you know, when we're looking at that and the anatomic position, you want to draw a line here and you want to draw a line here. Proximal and distal are getting closer to that midline, right? That's closest to this, not just the midline, but the center of your body, right? You've got a midline, you've got another midline, and then you've got the center, which is where both midlines meet. This also works really well when usually we'll use proximal and distal when we're talking about the arms, because we're talking about how to get back, you know, to the center of the body. Like if you were to draw, like take a marker and draw back to my center, right, from my elbow, and then take another marker and draw a line from my wrist back to my center, right? The second one, the wrist is farther away from my center, so the wrist is considered distal compared to the elbow, which is considered proximal in this case, right? So that's where you usually, when you're using proximal and distal, you usually have to give a second point of reference, generally. So the elbow is proximal to, and then we say the wrist, right? The ankle is distal compared to the knee. Your knee is closer, so therefore the knee is proximal in this case, making the ankle distal. And then there's two that we don't use that often, but I guess they come up every now and then, which are contralateral and ipsilateral. Contralateral is on the opposite side of the body. So your right hand is contralateral to your left hand, right? They are opposites of each other. And then you have ipsilateral, which is where like your right hand is ipsilateral to your right ear. They're both on the same side of the body. So contralateral, the right hand is contralateral to the left hand. Ipsilateral, the right hand is ipsilateral to the right foot, right? It's on the same side. So right to right, right to left. One is contradicting the other one, if you want to think of it that way. So those are our anatomic locations. How's everybody feeling on that so far? Does anybody have is anything not clear on those? Everybody good on like proximal and distal? Cool, cool. Let me know if you have questions, guys. Okay, so the next one we've got are our planes of motion. So your planes of motion are these three imaginary planes that we kind of divide the body up into, where we kind of take a look. We generally move along one of these planes primarily at a time. You know, like whenever we're describing like certain movements, certain exercises, generally those movements or exercises are taking place in one of these planes of motion at a time. You know, now obviously I want to say this up front. There's not a single exercise that only perfectly moves in one plane. You know what I mean? But in general, they tend to predominate in one plane over another, you know? And so these are sort of what we're talking about here, these different, there we go, there's the one from your textbook actually. These are your actual planes of motion, right? So you can see this one right here, this guy's being divided into a front half and a back half, right? It's cutting him, you know, down the middle, you know, like this. Like if I had an imaginary, like, you know, sheet of glass running through my body this way, right? That would be dividing me on the frontal plane. And so I can only move along that frontal plane, right? And so I can do things like this, right? These are all the types of motions that are frontal plane motions, right? Side to side motions, right? Imagine like you're on a tightrope, right? And you can only move, you know, this way, right? That's a frontal plane movement. So things like abduction or things like adduction, lateral flexion, right? Those movements are all frontal plane movements. So that's what we're talking about there. The planes of motion are these three imaginary planes that are positioned at right angles on the body, right? They're all right angle to each other. They intersect at the very dead center of your body. And movement generally occurs in one plane at a time and moves in the direction of the plane. So it moves parallel to that plane. And again, all of this is from the anatomic position. So when you're looking at it, right, the frontal plane is dividing you into front and back halves. You can see that here, right here, right? So there's the frontal plane. And the movements that occur there, like I said, the primary ones are going to be abduction and adduction, right? So I'm abducted, my arms are being abducted by aliens, right? That's how like they go. Or I am adding my arms back to my body, right? That's abduction versus adduction. If it helps, sometimes people call this abduction and a deduction. So if you want to say it that way, you can. But then I don't think it's as fun because you don't get to use the alien example. So I like abduction, adduction. Then you've got the sagittal plane. The sagittal plane is going to divide you into left and right halves, right? So you're going to get divided into a left side and a right side because it's going to go through your midline like this, right? So that is our sagittal plane, right? And so motions, again, they occur you know, along parallel to that plane. So you've got motions that are going front to back like this. If I raise my arms like this, or I drop my hands down like that, or I bend over at the waist, or I come up like this, I do crunches, right? Squats, all those things are very much sagittal motions. Walking forwards, walking backwards, that's sagittal. Frontal was side shuffling like this, right? So sagittal, frontal, right? So the sagittal plane, the primary motions there are going to be flexion and extension, right? So I've got like hip flexion and I've got hip extension. I've got shoulder flexion. I've got shoulder extension, elbow flexion, elbow extension, right? Spinal flexion, right? Spinal extension. So I'm moving along like that plane of motion there. So again, the frontal plane is primarily responsible for abduction and adduction. The sagittal plane is primarily responsible for flexion and extension. And then we've got the transverse plane. And the transverse plane is going to cut you in the middle, right? This is going to divide you into an upper and a lower half. Or, you know, a superior and an inferior half, right? So that's your transverse plane, right? Upper and lower halves. The movements here, you've got two categories of primary movements. You have got internal rotation, which would be rotating toward your midline. So if I were here in the anatomic position, see how my thumb's facing, you probably can't, I don't know if you guys can see it that well, but here's like my palm is facing forward, right? And my thumb's on the outside like this. If I do internal rotation, I would rotate inward toward my midline, right? So that's internal rotation, right? Then I've got external rotation, which would be rotating away from my midline, right? If I have my elbows here, right, I've got external rotation and I've got internal rotation. Even if I have my arm up like this, I've still got internal rotation and external rotation, because if I were in the anatomic position, it would look like that. So internal rotations spinning towards the midline, external rotations spinning away from the midline, right? And again, like if walking was the example, right? You've got sagittal, frontal, and transverse. I can't tell you guys how weird it is to do this on camera. I cannot explain to you the weird emotions I'm feeling. So those are sort of our three primary motions. Now, there is one more in the transverse plane that's really important, and that's horizontal adduction and horizontal abduction. So remember, adduction is adding to the midline. Abduction is abducting away from the midline. Well, what if that was happening like in this direction, right? Well, that's where your shoulder comes in, and you have horizontal, because now instead of moving vertically, we're moving this way, right? I've got horizontal adduction and horizontal abduction. So a push-up, right, is horizontal adduction because I'm adding, you know, to my midline. And then like a row is horizontal abduction because I'm moving right away from my midline. And it's happening on the transverse plane because, right, that is dividing me this way. And so I'm moving along it like this. So those are our primary categories: flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal rotation, external rotation, horizontal adduction, horizontal abduction. And those are our main ones. There are a few special ones, right? There are some special movements we got to talk about. We got to look at the scapula, for instance. Your ankle is really weird. Your ankle's got some special terms there as well. But those are sort of our primary ones, right? So horizontal abduction movement that is transverse from anterior to lateral, and then horizontal adduction from lateral to anterior. Your scapula, your shoulder blade, kind of a weird part of the body, gets to do a lot more movement than really anything else. And so because of that, it's got its own special terms here. So if we're just talking about like scapular movements, right? These are sort of some special movements that your shoulder blades are able to make. You've got four primary ones here. You have got scapular protraction, which is this, right? That's bringing my shoulder blades around my body, right? I'm literally rotating them around like this. Most of us, thanks to our phones, tend to have a little bit too much scapular protraction, right? But then you also have scapular retraction. I'm moving my spine at the same time. I'm gonna try and keep my spine straight. So protraction, retraction, right? So that is, you know, pulling your shoulder, pinching your shoulder blades back. That's scapular retraction. Rounding them forward, that's scapular protraction. And then you've got scapular elevation and you've got scapular depression, right? And for the most part, your shoulders sit pretty neutral. You know, they really should only be able to depress maybe 5 degrees at the most, but they can elevate a lot, right? So we got elevation, depression, protraction, retraction. Those are all special. So when we're describing, like, you know, our movements and stuff, we want to understand sort of which plane of motion these are primarily taking place in. So there's some more there's some more terms that sometimes get, you know, a little confusing. How you guys feeling about those terms? Awesome possum. Oh yeah, Irene. Oh, you took your hand up. I didn't even notice. What's up? Question.
Yes, Brad. You know, with the planes of motion, when you're nodding yes, that would be front.
Sagittal. So I'm going like this. Yes. Right. That's front to back. So that's a sagittal movement, right? If I were going yes or like no, right? This would be a transverse movement. And then if I were like tilting side to side like this would be a frontal movement.
Okay, got it.
Yep. What if I just passed out right there?
No, don't do that.
Right, everybody's like, Brad's got high blood pressure. After keeping my eyes on the news, I have been. So let's take a look at our muscle actions here, right? So now we need to kind of look at how our muscles actually contract, right? So moving outside of our planes, moving outside of our movements, we got to talk about like how we can actually make this movement occur. So we've got eccentric versus concentric. So now if we take a look here, we've got a couple different versions of like our muscles contracting, right? If you take a look here, right, let's say like this little picture here, you know, let's say, you know, right now the muscle is just kind of remaining at this length, right? This is let's say this is close to neutral length for this muscle, right? But then see how like the muscle is shortening, it's contracting right now. And that contraction is what's pulling this forearm this way, which is, you know, giving us the elbow curl, right? So this muscle is shortening, right? Well, that is what we call a concentric contraction, right? Versus an eccentric contraction, which is where our muscle is lengthening, right? See how it's like kind of pulled apart compared to this version here, right? So there's movement of a shortening and then there's movement of a lengthening. That's concentric versus eccentric, right? Actually, I don't like that. So that is our three main muscle actions, right? So in terms of muscle actions, every muscle in your body can do this, by the way. All of your muscles, well, I mean, they all do this. There are some that don't really do a ton of concentric work. You know, like if you think of like your abdominals, for instance, like your transverse, they kind of just generates pressure and stabilizes for the most part. But at a very small level, it's you know, concentrically doing something. So yeah, don't worry about the technicals. Every muscle in your body, every muscle in your body can do this. It can all your muscles can shorten and lengthen, and then all of them can also just like contract and kind of stay the same length, right? So eccentric contractions, these are contractions that occur when a muscle is lengthening, right? So if my muscle, right, let's say like I'm gonna roll my sleeve up here, like my bicep is all bunched up right now. So if I lengthen out that muscle, right? See how it went from being bunched up to being pulled apart, right? That's an eccentric muscle action, right? That's associated, eccentric contractions are associated with force reduction. So if I've got like a super heavy weight in my arms and I I'm reducing that force, right, as it's going down to the ground, right? That's an eccentric contraction, right? I'm like lowering myself into a chair, right? That's eccentric. Versus concentric, which is like force production. I'm producing force to come out of the chair, right? So if the contraction of the muscle is generating less force than a resistance, like I weigh 175 pounds, right? So if I generate in my glutes and quads, if I generate 174 pounds, right, that's 1 pound less than gravity is pulling on me, right? If I generate less force than the resistance, then I'm going to eccentrically lengthen and reduce force into like a, a lengthened position, right? Versus the opposite of eccentric, which is our concentric contractions, right? Concentric contractions occur when a muscle is shortening. So if I weigh, like I said, I weigh 175 pounds. If I generate 176 pounds of force, that's 1 pound more, then my muscles can shorten and they can overcome that resistance and produce force. So then I would rise out of the chair, right? So eccentric, concentric, right? Eccentric, concentric. So again, if I had dumbbells in my hand, right, that would be concentric, eccentric, concentric, eccentric, right? So eccentric is lengthening, concentric is shortening. And then in the middle, you have isometrics, okay? Isometrics are contractions that occur when your muscle is maintaining length. So if I were to go back to my closet door, right, and I'm gonna try and like push this door as hard as I can, right? I can't move that any further, right? Like it's not gonna go anywhere. If I just push on it and I try to push as hard as I can, I'm trying to generate enough force to overcome it, but I can't. I don't have enough force production. So my muscles, they're gonna try to shorten and then they're gonna get stuck in one position and they can't shorten any further. That's an isometric contraction. So if I like squat down and I hold right here and I just stay like this, right? This is an isometric contraction, right? I'm not doing anything. My muscles are going to a specific length and they're staying at that length. So I could be isometric here, 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 here. Doesn't matter where I'm at. Isometric is isometric. It's just you holding your muscle in one specific length. You can think of this as force stabilization, right? You know what? I always use my bicep as an example because you guys can see it on camera really easily. But I'm going to show you the perfect example of isometric concentric. Let's see here, Captain Helicopter. You guys probably remember this from the Marvel movies. Chris Evans and his stupid huge biceps. But this is a classic example, like where this thing's trying to pull away and he's not letting it, right? So if we get past the McDonald's ad during personal training school, all right, here we go. Skipping forward. Here we go. All right, so he is eccentrically losing the battle, right? He is trying to hold this helicopter and the helicopter's winning. So that's eccentric, right? Then suddenly, right at the end, he finally gets a little grip. That's isometric, right? He's holding it in one position, isometric contractions. And then he kind of like for a second there, and he starts moving it, right? So that's a little concentric. He starts overcoming this resistive force, right? And then all of a sudden it all goes to hell. So that's a kind of classic example, right? If the resistive force is winning, that would be lengthening your muscles, right? So if I'm trying to, if I've got a 150-pound barbell and I'm out of strength, and it's just slowly winning the battle and dropping back down, right? My muscles are lengthening. That would be eccentric. I'm reducing the force down. But if I were, trying to get it up and I'm stuck and it's just not going forward, it's not coming down, it's just stuck in one position, that would be isometric. But if my muscles are overcoming that force and they're shortening, that would be concentric. So there is one special little term I want to mention right now. This is not actually in this PowerPoint. This is going to come up later on in this module. When we get to the sports performance class, there's another term that we're going to learn that you've probably heard me use a couple times before, but it's really important in athletics. And it's a version of isometric. It's called amortization. Has anybody ever heard this word before, amortization?
I have not.
No? Raul, have you heard this?
No, I don't know that.
Okay, so sometimes you'll hear this word and it won't refer to like movements. All right, so like if you have investments, right? Let's say you like put money into an investment, right? Well, what's going to happen is like you just lost a lot of money. You know, like, I mean, you didn't lose it. You're using it to do something with, right? You're investing it so that it will make you more money in the end. But you did, you know, you don't have access to that money right now. So you kind of lost some of it. And then what's going to happen is that money is going to earn you money until eventually you have more money earned than you initially put in, right? That's how investing works. Well, that transitionary period is called amortization in the world of finance. And it's where like you got to spend money to make money. And it's the transfer time in between. Ideally, we want that time to be short. You know, like I don't want you to, we want that amortization to be quick, you know, like I want to start making money now, you know, like that's amortization. Well, in your muscles, amortization is the transfer between eccentric to concentric. So let's take a look right here, right? Like if I were doing a body weight squat, right? And I were going down and then I were coming back up. The little tiny transfer, I'm down, 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 up, 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 right? That transfer between one to the other, that's called amortization. It's the stabilizing transition that takes place when you're switching from eccentric to concentric. So, you know, Eugenia, we haven't talked about this yet, but just talking about like exercise tempo, right? Guys, if you were doing a 202 tempo, right? That's 2 seconds eccentric, 2 seconds concentric with no isometric. That transfer between, that's your amortizing period. That's amortization, right? This is a really important concept when we start talking about jumping. When we start talking about plyometrics, this becomes really important, which is why I'm mentioning it now, because this is the sports module, and we're going to do a lot of jumping later in this mod when we get to program design. And so when we talk about amortization, I want that transfer from like lengthening to shortening. I want that transfer to be as fast as possible. What I don't want to see when someone's jumping is this. That's a slow, like I held the bottom, right? What I want to see is this, right? Bouncing, boom, boom, one to the other. That's, we want your amortization phase to be as short as possible. I saw a comment. Yeah. Yeah, we want to bake those brownies, then we want to eat them immediately. We want that cool down period to be short. So anyway, in the end, eccentric contractions are lengthening, concentric contractions are shortening, isometric contractions are maintaining length, and amortization is the stabilizing, that's a maintaining of length while you're transitioning. So amortization is an example of isometric. But generally, when we think of isometric, we think of like a long hold. Amortization, we want it to be a short stabilizing. But stabilizing is holding, which is why it's in that category. All right, Eugenia, how you feeling? This is your first time seeing these. How you holding up?
Yeah, it's hard to understand.
I know it is quick at first. I've got some extra videos, by the way, if you want me to send them your way, that can be really helpful in explaining some of this stuff. But all right, so luckily we are out. That is it. That is it for the main major terminology for the day. I would say the rest of this is really important, but that is all the term, you know, in order to talk like you just learn the alphabet, right? That's the alphabet to talk about movement. The rest of this stuff is talking about like poetry, right? The rest of this is like concepts, like understanding, this is a little more conceptual based from here on. So we're going to talk a little bit more about like what it means to move a certain way, and why like certain movements are good and certain movements are bad, right? So I would actually say if you only have enough like memorizing capability, I would memorize the first half of this, because these concepts will actually come naturally to you as we sort of talk about things. But obviously, it's all important. So the traditional perception of our muscles, right, is that they only work like concentrically, and that they only work in one plane of motion. This is what you usually hear people say in the gym, right? Like, when you look at your basic workout, most exercises are sagittal. A lot of them are, they're walking lunges, they're body weight squats, they're leg curls, leg extensions, bicep curls, tricep extensions, chin ups. A lot of like movements that we generally pick tend to be very, very, very sagittal. And we know that that's just not how the body moves, like look at how many people sprain their ankle, right? Lateral ankle sprains are the most common sports-related injury, right? That's where you tear that little ligament on the outside of your ankle, like right here, right? And that is because what will often happen is somebody will be moving sideways and they'll roll their ankle, and then that ankle is not used to being stretched like that. So then all of a sudden you tear that ligament. And it's like, well, yeah, they only trained in the sagittal plane, right? They went front to back all the time. They never practiced going side to side. Or you'll hear about somebody tearing their ACL in their knee, right? And ACL tears often happen during a plant and cut situation where somebody tries to transversely change planes of motion. They go like this, and all of a sudden they tear their ACL because they trained sagittal, but they didn't train transverse. So that's sort of the traditional theory behind working out. A lot of people spend all their time doing stuff like this or this, and they never take the time to learn how to do this or twisting, rotational movements, stuff like that. So that's not a very good way to train. We want to make sure that we're training our clients in all planes of motion, right? We want to be better than the basic, boring trainer who puts their clients on machines and says 3 sets of 12, I'm gonna go get a smoothie. Like, that's a crappy trainer. So we don't want to be that, right? And we also don't want to be the type of person. How often do you guys see somebody in the gym, they'll lift really heavy and they'll go, right? And they just they only train concentrically, right? I get it. The concentric part, guys, I get is what burns the most. So like mentally, we think that like this builds muscle and this doesn't matter, right? That we usually see people do that in the gym. That is not true, right? Now you're not teaching your muscles how to lengthen, and you're not teaching your muscles how to stabilize, right? So you'll see people like do a heavy barbell squat and they'll go like, they'll lift really heavy on one part and they don't care about the other two parts, right? And it's like, no. We want to go slow on the way down. We want to teach ourselves how to do that lengthening. We want to teach ourselves how to pause like this, and then we want to learn how to come up. The concentric part is actually pretty natural. It's going to happen, whether you like it or not. But we need to teach our muscles how to work in all three muscle actions. We need concentric, we need eccentric, we need isometric. And we need the frontal plane, we need the sagittal plane, and we need the transverse plane, It's funny, the gym is a dangerous place if you think about it, right? It's full of heavy equipment. You're doing these motions that are, somewhat putting you at risk, The whole point of the gym is to create, to damage your body so that your body will grow. It's a fairly dangerous place, but my clients never get hurt in the gym. When I start training somebody, people always get hurt in the car, reaching back to grab a sweatshirt before they park, and then they tear something in their shoulder. Or they hurt themselves gardening, or picking a book up off the living room. you know, like living room floor. So like, you know, that's where people hurt themselves. And it's because like they train in one way and they're just not used to doing these other types of motion. You know, even me, like that's how my sacrum, when it got popped out of place, you know, I didn't have, I'm sure the reason that happened is because I just didn't have the right type of like pelvic stability at the time. Because maybe I was doing primarily one type of training, you know? So it's really, really important for us to train our muscles through all of the muscle action spectrum. You know, we need concentric, we need eccentric, we need isometric, and all of our planes of motion. We need frontal, sagittal, and transverse training. Okay, moving out of that, moving out of the terminology, I mean, there's obviously more terms, you can see them, but moving into some more like conceptual stuff. Let's talk about the philosophy of what makes a good trainer, you know? First, we got to talk about like what, you know, force is, right? And I'm not talking about like Star Wars, although I wish I was talking about Star Wars, that'd be great. We're just talking about force. We're talking about our muscles here. So force is defined as the interaction between two entities or bodies that results in either the acceleration or deceleration of an object. That is a very technical term. Basically, force is either something that moves or something that like speeds something up or something that slows something down. That's what force is, right? Or maybe it's something that like holds something in place, right? That's what force is. So your muscles, because they have the ability with those actin and myosin proteins that we talked about a couple of days ago, right? They are able to bind to each other and pull. That creates a shortening. That would be force production. And if those fibers are pulling apart and lengthening, that would be force reduction. And then if they're holding it in place, that's, you know, force stabilization. So if my 1 rep max on a barbell squat is 100 pounds, right? Let's say I can put a 100-pound barbell on my back, you know, and I can lift exactly like the, you know, I can do it one time. I can do 100 pounds once, right? So the maximal force production that my glutes, hamstrings, quads, calves, my core, the maximal force production I can handle during squatting motions, I can generate 100 pounds of force, right? That would be the case. Now, obviously, if you were my trainer and you wanted me to lift, you know, let's say 12 repetitions, right? Like, because that's the workout. You're like, well, we're going to focus on, you know, 12 repetitions today. I can only generate 100 pounds of force once. But what that means, with a little bit of math, is that I can generate about 75 pounds of force around 12 times. That's about 75% of my 1 rep max. And I'm going to teach you guys how to tie those numbers together later. But that's sort of what we're looking at when we talk about force, right? We have to understand how force interacts with our body and how our body generates force if we're going to understand movement. So there is an ideal length at which your muscles can generate force. This is one of our key concepts. When I tell you, you know, when I talk about like good posture versus bad posture, what I mean by that is like good posture indicates to me that your muscles are resting at a good length. They're resting at an ideal length. But if you have bad posture, that indicates to me that your muscles are resting at a poor length. They're either resting in a shortened position or they're resting in a lengthened position. You know, that's what we're seeing. So if I look at like bad posture, let's look at poor posture here, because that's what this whole course is really about, right? If I look at poor posture, you know, just Google that. The first thing you're gonna see is rounded shoulders. They always show you like, you know, this is the first thing people talk about. I swear I recognize that girl. Am I crazy? So there you go. See like a little bit of shoulder rounding, right? That's sort of the poor posture that we're talking about. Let's take a look right here, right? This is a very classic picture. Actually, ooh, there's one with skeleton. This is sort of a classic picture, right? You can see he's got like shoulder rounding here. Actually, where's the other one? Go back. Or here, we can see he's kind of got like this excessive low back arch, right? His pelvis is being tilted forward. So the reason this is bad, right? The reason we call this poor posture is because the muscles are not sitting at an ideal length. And so because those muscles are sitting in either an already shortened or an already lengthened position, they're not going to be as strong as they're supposed to be. They should be much stronger than they are. So that's where we look at this idea of what we call a length tension relationship. There is a relationship between the length of a muscle and how much tension it can generate. So that's what we're saying here. It's the length of a muscle and how much, and it's the length at which a muscle can produce the greatest amount of force. On a more scientific note, if you look at if you zoom in on your muscle fibers, it's the greatest amount of overlap between those actin and myosin proteins. So you remember when we were talking about actin and myosin in our muscular system, right? We talked about how they have to have, myosin's got to be able to reach up and grab that actin and pull it, right? But if it's already pulled, if it's already in a shortened position, then there's nowhere to go. Your muscle can't generate any more force. So it's weaker than it should be. Likewise, if your muscles pulled apart, your muscle fibers, and the actin can't get or the myosin can't get grip on the actin, well, that's going to be a weak muscle too. And that means that you have an inefficient, ineffective muscle, right? So this is sort of what we're seeing here in a length tension relationship. Oops. See right here, this is an overly shortened muscle. I'm going to pull up a better picture. I'm going to pull that up. Length tension relationship. Yeah, we'll use this one just because I can zoom in on it. So take a look right here. See, this is like a miniature version. This is that actin and myosin, right? So actin and myosin length tension, right? Oh, that's even better. Yeah, you can actually see more there. Okay, this is even better. Okay, so see right here, right? This is an ideal actin and myosin, right? There's the thick filament, there's the thin filament. And look at how there's some space to move here, there's some space to move here, right? And there's a pretty good amount of overlap here, right? This is really good, ideal overlap of these. That means that the myosin, this thick filament, can get a really good grip on the actin. But it's also got plenty of room to move. So there's lots of grip and there's plenty of room to move. This is exactly what we talk about. This is why we observe good posture. If somebody had this going on in their muscles, that means that, in their upper body, they're probably standing about like this, right? I can't zoom, I can't, take a microscope and look at their muscle fibers in their pecs, but based on if I know this is ideal resting posture of the pec muscles, and I look at them and I observe that they're standing kind of like this, that shows me that they've got a really good length tension relationship. Now, if they were like this, right? Let's say they've got rounded shoulders, something like that, right? What that shows me, if I look at your posture and I observe that, that shows me that you're on this side of the chart. Your muscles are all, look at how little space there is to move, right? See the amount of space there is here? There really isn't anywhere for the actin and the myosin to go. And here, that's like a fully contracted muscle, right? That really can't go anywhere, right? So this is already overactive, but this is that's somebody walking around like this, So that's definitely not super ideal. So both of these are on what we call the overactive side of muscle actions, right? They have a decreased length. The muscles are shortened, right? This is what my hamstrings look like every day. And so the amount of force that they can produce, right? The tension that they can produce, the force that muscle can generate is reduced. It's not as strong as it should be. Over here, this is ideal. Now, on the other side of things, I just talked about, it was good to have some space, but it's also not good to have too much space, right? So take a look right here. Look at the myosin. It can barely get a grip on that actin. It's barely holding on with a fingertip, well, this is also a reduced force situation. Both of these are underactive muscles, right? This muscle cannot generate as much force either. So when we look at somebody with ideal posture, right? What I notice is if they stand like this, right? I know their pecs are not overly shortened, and I know that their rhomboids, the muscles in their shoulder blades, they're not overly lengthened. But if I've got rounding like this, right, these muscles here are weaker than they should be because they are overactive, right? They're in a shortened state already. Meanwhile, my upper back muscles back here, they're being pulled apart. So they're in a lengthened position. They are longer than they should be. And so what I have is I have overactive muscles, muscles that are firing too much, and I've got underactive muscles, muscles that are not firing enough. So when I use those terms, and I am going to use those terms a lot, and I say you've got an overactive muscle and an underactive muscle, what I'm describing is you have you have a bad length tension relationship. You've got a muscle that's underactive, it's too long, and you've got a muscle that's overactive, it's too short. And I gotta warn you guys, NASM will use all of these terms and they're just gonna interchange them like crazy. That's one thing that sometimes confuses people when they go to take their overall exam. Sometimes NASM will say, your client has shoulder rounding. Which of the following muscles is overactive? And then you'd have 4 options, right? It would be the pectoralis, right? Or sometimes they'll say, your client has shoulder rounding. Which of the following muscles is shortened? Same thing, right? Just means shortened means overactive, lengthened means underactive. They are exactly the same thing. So lengthening a muscle beyond its optimal length means that there is not enough actin and myosin overlap, so that will result in reduced force production. Shortening a muscle beyond its optimal length, optimal amount of overlap, that will also result in reduced force production. So let's go back to my example. I said that, let's just say for the example that I was using, I've got a 100-pound barbell, right? And I can lift 100 pounds once, right? That's my 1 rep max, 100 pounds, right? Let's just say for the sake of argument. Well, if you were my trainer and you notice that I have a really bad anterior pelvic tilt, right? I've got this weird posture where my pelvis is being pulled down. I got like Instagram booty, right? And I'm walking around like this all the time. If that's the case, I've got overactive muscles here in my hips, right? My hip flexors, which their job is to do this, right? But instead, they're so tight, they're so overactive, they stay in this shortened position, they're pulling my pelvis down this way. Meanwhile, my low back, my erector spinae muscle, it's also overactive. And so it's pulling up on my low back like that. So now I'm getting both of these. This is pulling down, this is pulling up. And so I'm going like this, right? Both of those muscles are overactive. Now, on the opposite side of things, my glutes, which are down below my erector spinae, and my abs, which are up above my hip flexors, these are both underactive, right? This is being pulled, this is being like shortened, this is being lengthened, right? This is being shortened, this is being lengthened. So now I've got overactive, underactive, overactive, underactive, right? I've got this like cross situation going on. So you as my trainer saw that I can do 100 pounds on a barbell squat. And then you take me over to the stretching area and you have me stretch out those overactive muscles, right? Stretch out those hip flexors, right? And I stretch out that erector spinae, right? Do like a spinal twist. And I stretch out these 2 overactive. And then I get them turned off. Now they're not overactive anymore. And you go have me do a plank and that turns my abs on. And you have me go do a floor bridge and that turns my glutes on. So now you turn the underactive stuff on and you turn the overactive stuff off. Well, now I go back under that barbell and I'm like, put 100 pounds on there and I'm like, 1, and that was as many as I could do before, but then I'm like, you know what, I feel good. 2, 3, you know, like now I'm knocking them out. I would be stronger after you turn off those overactive muscles and turn on the underactive stuff. Because now my body can move the way it was designed. And so you've just helped my posture, which was helped my strength. Conceptually, does that make sense to everybody? That big, long, what did I spend like 20 minutes on that? That is kind of the concept for this whole class. Essentially what this class is is to teach you how to recognize those altered postures and how to fix them. So that's a really, that's kind of the, like when people ask me like, how do you pick your exercises for your clients? I always tell them, I'm like, I look at their posture. Your body will tell me what exercises to give you. If I look, I mean, look at me right now. Like I'm sitting here on this stool, rounded shoulders, right? I should be sitting upright like this. It's not as comfy, which is a bad thing. It should be comfy. That means that my core is not engaged, right? I need to like get myself back upright, right? That's what will tell me what exercises to give my clients, right? That's how we write programs. So that's your length tension relationships. Now, obviously, you've also got situations. We were just looking at how like you've got overactive on one side and you've got underactive on another. By the way, that also looks kind of like this. I always pull up this picture, but like that's also, it kind of looks like this. This is ideally pulling on both sides. These are both equal versus this, which is like shortened over here, lengthened over here, right? Well, now my joints can't, my bones can't move the way they're supposed to, right? Well, that is very much like an overactive, underactive situation between two opposite muscles. This can also happen in helper muscles. Sometimes you can get a helper muscle that takes over for a weakened muscle. My hamstrings, like I said, are an example of that. My hamstrings are really overactive. I have really tight hamstrings. I always have, I got an MRI once for an MCL tear. And even the doctor was looking, he's like, "Whoa, boy, look at your hamstrings." He's like, "You got a little tiny tendon back there." Sometimes it's genetic, sometimes you're just stuck with it. But what happens is because my hamstrings are so overactive, they like to do what my glutes are supposed to do. And so like before I do any like barbell squatting and stuff, or even definitely deadlifting, I always have to make sure that I stretch my hamstrings out really sufficiently. Otherwise, my hamstrings will take over for my squats, or they'll take over for my deadlifts. And you'll see when I do it. Actually, I haven't stretched out since I worked out this morning. But when you see me like squat, sometimes you'll notice I will actually kind of squat like this. I'll have this really kind of far forward, like knee way past the toe situation. And it's because my hamstrings are firing like crazy, trying to do my squat for me. If I don't properly warm up, that'll kind of happen. And it's because I have an altered force couple. Okay. So what a force couple is, I always make this joke. When I say force couple, I'm not talking about, Kim and Kanye. A force couple are muscles that are working together to move a joint through its full range of motion. So, you've got one muscle on one side of a joint, you've got an opposite muscle on the other side of the joint, and you've got a helper muscle, which is there to kind of assist the main muscle, right? So you got Batman and the Joker, and you've got Robin, right? You've got like they're all there. Like Batman is working against Joker, Robin's there to help Batman, right? Like that's sort of what a force couple is. It's muscles working around a joint. The classic example of a force couple, you can see it right here, right? Here's like your shoulder blade, right? You've got muscles that pull down this way. You got muscles that pull down this way, muscle that pulls back, muscle that pulls up. And then you've got all these muscles that are pulling, on the front of the arm here. So like they're passing it through a full range of motion. The classic example that you do every single day is steering wheel, right? Imagine you have both hands on the steering wheel, right? I pull up with this hand and I pull down with this hand simultaneously. That's a force couple, right? They're working together, right? As I pull up here, I'm pulling down here, but I'm creating stabilization between the two of them, right? So again, like we got to remember that as we have like force couples here, if we look at like our force couples and how they are working through this full range of motion, we want all of our muscles to be very functional. If I've got one muscle that's really eager and overactive, right? So for instance, let's say this muscle right here, the upper trap muscle, right? That's your neck here, right? Is overactive, which we know it commonly is because so many people walk around like this all day, right? What that's gonna do is whenever I try to raise my arm up, I'm not gonna raise my arm up the way I'm supposed to. I'm gonna raise my arm up like this. And that's not what I'm going for. I'm gonna do a shoulder press instead of like this. I'm gonna do a shoulder press like this. right? I don't want to be doing all that. And that's going to mess up my range of motion. That's going to move me the way I'm not supposed to do. And I'm going to lose strength. I'm going to lose the ability to produce force the way I'm supposed to. So again, it all comes back down to posture, right? We're looking at someone's posture and I'm observing. It's like, okay, let's say you see somebody who does this kind of thing. They're lifting and they do that. You'll see people use their abs, and it's like clearly they've got a weakened position in this. Something is happening that is weak in this shoulder. And so then they're tilting to make up for that weakness. There's some other muscle that's contracting there. So I need to go back to my assessments and I need to look and figure out what muscle is firing improperly in order to understand like what I need to give a little bit of extra love and extra attention, right? It's like, got it. You've got, you're elevated here. This muscle's too tight. We need to do an extra stretch for the side of your neck every day before we start. Otherwise, you're going to learn this bad form, So that's your force couples. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one right here. This is actually more of a kinesiology thing, but you'll remember this from our kinesiology class. You do have leverage, which is important as well. We can use leverage to our advantage. Let's say you're at the gym and you've got a pair of 5-pound dumbbells and you've got a pair of 10-pound dumbbells, right? And, you're trying to do, some type of raise like this, and 5 pounds is too easy, but 10 pounds is too hard. And you're like, well, what the heck? I don't want to do 5 pounds because that's not enough effort, but I don't want to do 10 pounds because I can't do 10 pounds. Well, when we talk about leverage, the closer your weight is to like whatever joint you're moving. So in this case, if you're doing this movement, the joint you're moving is your shoulder joint. The closer the weight is to that. So if I were to bend my elbow like this and do my shoulder raises, the motion's the same, right? This is the same as this. But now that I move the weight closer, this is going to feel lighter. So I could probably do those 10-pound dumbbells like this. Then once I get stronger, I can start taking them out like this. And that's where leverage comes in. You'll notice like the closer the weight is to side. So like looking at like this guy here, he's taking this dumbbell and he's raising it up like this. And it's going to feel the heaviest right here. This is the heaviest this dumbbell is going to feel. And then once it gets up here, you'll notice the dumbbell is very close. It'll actually feel relatively light again. And it'll feel really light down here. So that's the closer the weight is, the less, we call that torque, by the way. The closer the weight is to the center of the joint, the less torque there is. Don't worry about that though, guys. Honestly, that one, I want you to move past that concept. That concept is not super key for this course. We talked about it a lot in kinesiology. So you need to know it, but like, Eugenia, for instance, like you haven't been through kinesiology yet, so you're good on that one. All right, motor behavior, this is another one. We talk about like how we learn these movements, right? So motor behavior is like, this is like how we get our habits, like me, my bad habit of, you can't see it right now, but I've got one leg tucked under me. You'll notice I try to switch it as often as I can. But that's, that's motor behavior is sort of, it really is your movement habits, right? It describes how we move. So motor behavior, how the kinetic chain is able to create and learn movements, and so it's made up of two major concepts here. Your motor control, which is how your nervous system integrates information to produce movements. And your motor learning, which is how your body sort of learns how to do things slowly over time, leading to relatively like permanent changes, like I haven't ridden an actual like bicycle in years. Not since I did like a triathlon several years ago. And I was like, I hate this and I'm never coming back. But even then, like when I picked up that bicycle again, I hadn't done that in years either. But my brain remembered how to do it from when I was a kid, You really don't ever forget how to ride a bike, That's thanks to motor learning. Your brain sort of has that those neurons programmed in. And so It is it's taking your motor control with practice and experience to kind of learn how to do something slowly over time. This is one of the biggest reasons why it is so important for us when we're training our clients to fix their overactive and to fix their underactive muscles before they start training. I don't want you to come into the gym and not be stretched out. And like some people look at that and they're like, why? Because it's risky. I never stretch and I've never got hurt. And then, I've heard that argument a million times. So it was like, I don't stretch that often and I've never pulled a muscle. And, people think that that's the only reason they stretch out is to avoid pulling a muscle. And that's one of the reasons, right? One of the most important reasons is like, hey, it's not because I'm worried about you pulling a muscle, although I am worried about that. It's because like when you don't stretch out, you move wrong. And when you move wrong, you memorize how to move wrong. And then you suck at exercising. Harsh. So that's your motor learning, right? We always want to make sure that we stretch out properly. I told you guys my nephew Cody is, he just started an exercise program that I put him on. And he was telling me how he used to play football and he sprained his ankle 100 million times. And I was like, you got to do your calf stretches. And he was like, yeah, I know. He's like, it's just, stretching is tough. And I'm like, it is tough, but you have to do it. And he's like, I don't feel that much better when I stretch. I'm like, it's not about how you feel. It's about you moving the way you're supposed to move. And if you're not properly stretched out, I know that your form sucks. And he's like, all right, and that kind of convinced him. But the more you practice moving the right way, the better you're going to get at moving the way you're supposed to move. And that, again, is kind of coming back to posture. And it does come back to our big concept here, this concept that I love to mention, that proprioception, right? Your body's understanding of where it is in space. It's your spatial awareness. So you're getting information from all over the place. And we have constantly altered proprioception, right? Information is coming from mechanoreceptors, right? Remember those muscle spindles we talked about? We talked about those Golgi tendon organs, right? Those receptors that are telling your brain what length the muscle's at, right? Well, we talked about this before. Those things lie. They tell your brain that they're already in a lengthened position. They couldn't possibly stretch any further, right? And so what ends up happening is your body kind of moves the way it's not supposed to, right? Like you'll start squatting and your feet will turn, you'll start going down and then your ankles go, you know what? We can't stretch any further. Obviously they can, but your brain gets the signal saying, no, we can't stretch any further. So what it does is it turns like that. And then you don't have to stretch those muscles anymore, right? They get to stay in their little shortened positions rather than lengthening like they're supposed to. And that's altering your movement. So when you have altered proprioception, you have altered posture. And when you have altered posture, your muscles can deal with it for the most part, right? Like your muscles are like springy and they got lots of blood flow and things like that. But your tendons, they don't have very much blood flow. Your ligaments, they're attached to hard tissue. That's bone, right? Your bones do not have that much room to move. So then you get bones grinding, you end up with arthritis, you get ligaments that tear, you get tendons that tear, you get all of these injuries because you're lifting super, super heavy in a direction that your skeletal and muscular systems are not designed to move in, and your brain is learning the wrong way to do these movements. Sucks. So we got to stretch out. We got to make sure that we stretch the overactive muscles and we strengthen the underactive muscles so we can get your posture back to neutral. And I'm going to show you an example of that at the end of this lesson. Then we've also got sensory motor integration. This is another one that I'm going to kind of move through pretty quick. This is more of a kinesis thing. But sensory motor integration is your nervous system's ability to interpret information coming in and then use that information to execute the appropriate response. So, your nervous system gets that signal from the calf muscle that says, hey, we're already in a short, in a lengthened position. We can't possibly stretch any further. So then your brain goes, okay, turn the feet out, right? That'll allow us to still squat. Or you see somebody who squats like this, right? They've got really tight calves. So when they start squatting, calves don't want to stretch any further. So then they finish the movement by doing this, right? That's not a squat, that's a hinge, right? But my calves didn't have to stretch, so my brain figured out how to get the job done, but it didn't move the way it's supposed to move, right? Sensory motor integration is taking information and integrating it with some type of response. We want to have good sensory motor integration. We want to teach our brain how to move the way it's supposed to. Like when I start tilting because maybe the weight is really heavy, I want my brain to go, woo, we're tilting, and then get me back to neutral, right? I don't want my brain to go, oh, we're tilting, lift this way, and then like alter it and make it even worse, or, just get the job done. That is actually a term that we're going to come back to. We call that relative flexibility, right? It's like, yeah, you got a thing that was close to a squat done, but that's not really a squat, right? Like you did something similar. I don't know what to call it, but it's not an actual squat, So sensory motor integration, the thing we need to remember about it is it's only as effective as the information coming in. Your response to movement is only ever going to be as good as your actual like good form. Your body's only going to be able to move in response to the proper type of information. Again, that efficiency is really important. We need to learn how to recruit the right muscles at the right time for the right amount of force, and again, that all kind of comes back down to, we go back to our motor behavior. That's where we what we call motor learning, right? Motor learning, taking information in and through practice and repetition over and over and over and over again, we get better and better and better and better at these movements, right? So it looks at how movements are learned and how those movements are sort of retained for future use, right? At the end of the day, guys, this whole section in here, everything from here to here to here, it's all going to come down to you as a coach and just correcting people's form, being like, hey, shoulders back. Oh, that's really good. I love how you're engaging your core right there. Oh, hey, push those knees out a little bit for me. Oh, no, not the feet, just push the knees, right? Those little notes that you're continually giving your clients are just going to be a super, super, super helpful way for them to learn how to do it. And eventually their body's just going to know, That's another reason why we start our clients in the stabilization phase. Stabilization phase, lots of reps, and all of the reps are very slow. And so that's a lot of time for your brain to learn how to squat, to learn how to push, to press, to pull, to hinge, whatever. It's learning how to do those things slowly and effectively. So talking about the coaching, this is where feedback comes in, right? So feedback, right? Feedback is the use of sensory information and sensory motor integration to aid in the development of proper movement patterns. So this is like feedback is how we tell our clients what it is they are doing or what they should do, or what they're, like what we're looking for. This is how we give them information so that their brain can sort of interpret that and they can make adjustments. They can make those adjustments, they can feel those adjustments, and they can learn how to, execute the proper movement patterns. So there's sort of two types of feedback. There's internal feedback, which is exactly like it sounds. It's your client feeling what they're doing, right? So this is information coming into your nervous system from like sensory receptors, right? Like sensory feedback, right? Your mechanoreceptors, for instance, that's sensory feedback. So if you're trying to enhance the internal feedback in your client, what you want to do is you want to ask them, it's like, hey, do you feel how that's different than what you were doing, right? Let's say you had them doing a calf stretch, right? Let's say they were doing like a gastrocnemius stretch right here, right? And at first they kind of go into this position here. See how my foot's sort of turned away, right? And you go, hey, and they're like, yeah, I can feel that stretch in my calf. It's like, that's really good, but I want you to do me a favor. Get that foot pointing straight forward and squeeze that glute. You feel how that's different? And they go, oh my God, that's a deeper stretch. You're like, yeah. Now feel that memorize that. I want you to focus on that feeling. Whenever you do that calf stretch in the future, that's how I want it to feel. So what you're doing as a coach is you're encouraging your client to have internal feedback, right? Do you feel how that's different than just that, right? This is different than this. And they go, oh, okay, yeah, I start to feel that. It's like, great. I want you to pinch those shoulder blades back every single time. I want you to feel that, right? And then you've also got external feedback, which honestly, you speaking is actually an example of external feedback. You're fostering internal feedback, like you're encouraging them to feel it. But you talking to them, saying like, hey, you're rounding your shoulders, right? That's an example of external feedback. So external feedback is from like an outside source. Internal feedback is from an inside source, right? So external feedback, like a heart rate monitor, my heart rate is currently 80 beats per minute, right? That is external feedback. This watch is telling me what my heart rate is. A mirror, looking yourself in the mirror and being like, holy crap, I'm not straight. Like that's external feedback. All of those things, anything from an outside source. We like external feedback, but we don't want to be entirely reliant on it, right? We want our clients to use both internal and external at the same time. We want both of those feedbacks to happen simultaneously. Then when it comes to external feedback, there's sort of two different major sections here. There's knowledge of performance and knowledge of results. They're really, really similar. But knowledge of performance is used after the movement is over to say, hey, great job, or hey, that was, a little bit of a struggle there, right? So telling your client that it was good or bad, that's an example of like performance. It's like, hey, you performed well. And then there's knowledge of results, which is information about like the quality of the movement, right? So if you said like after they were done squatting and you told your client is like, hey, you did a really great job, right? That's knowledge of performance. And the reason you did a great job is because you were externally rotating your knees and you were engaging your glute more, and I could see that, right? So you're telling them what they did right. That's the knowledge of the results, right? So, a good squat would be like making sure that the knees are in alignment with the second and third toe there, right? So, if I told my client, hey, you're doing a great job, like you're not letting your knees cave in, right? As you're squatting down, you're doing a good job pushing those knees out at an angle, and they're tracking in line with your toes. So knowledge of performance would say, good job. Knowledge of results would say, I love how your knees track over your second and third toe. It's almost like knowledge of performance is the what, and knowledge of results is the why, if you want to think of it like that. That's how I kind of think of it in my head. And yeah, that's honestly that for now. Summarizing everything up in the PowerPoint here, right? Obviously, your human movement system, nervous system, muscular system, skeletal system, all of those are very interdependent. We talked today about like addressing the muscular system being shortened or lengthened. And we talked about how the nervous system is sort of causing that. And what that does is that moves your skeletal system in a way that could eventually cause damage, right? Which is why we need to fix it. You're going to use information, both internal and external, to understand how you're moving. That's your motor behavior. We're going to use that proprioception and sensory motor integration to understand these efficient movements. But your clients are going to get better and better and better at it through repeated exposure, practice, and effective practice, making sure that they're always moving with proper form. And yeah, that is everything. Do you guys have any questions on any of that stuff that we just went over? How are we feeling, everybody? Anything that needs clarity? Okay, I want to show you one example real quick before I let you guys go. So this is a video from NASM. So this is actually from NASM's, actually, is this the one I want? Which one is it? Is this guy? Yeah, it's this guy. All right, this is a video from NASM's YouTube channel, and it's gonna show you what to do with a client whose feet turn out, right? So here is somebody who has overactive and underactive muscles, and he's gonna kind of walk you through this. There's a quick fix. is going to get my video flagged.
For our overhead squat assessment, from the anterior view, we're going to begin by looking at the feet. When one squats, their feet should be able to stay nice and straight. The common compensation that we see is the feet turning out. So for Claire, we'll go ahead and line her up, 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. Feet, knees, and hips are nice and neutral. Neutral position there in the hips and shoulders are down and back. Now we'll ask her to reach both of her hands all the way overhead. Now from that anterior view, we're only going to look at the feet and the knees. We'll ask her to squat 3 to 5 times, about to the height of a normal chair. What we can see there immediately is that her feet start to turn out. We'll ask her just to do one more, and you can go ahead and relax. If we can see the compensation, there's no reason to continue making her squatting. We see her do it, and then we'll just move on from there. Now, the muscles that are overactive whenever the feet turn out are the lateral gastrocnemius, the short head of the biceps femoris, and the TFL. Now, let's identify those.
So really quickly, just explaining this really quick. So he said the lateral gastrocnemius, the biceps femoris, and the TFL. So her feet are turning out. The TFL is this muscle in the hip way up here, which ties down and becomes your IT band. And then it wraps down and ties to the top of your foot, and the version of the peroneals. So when you've got somebody whose foot is turning out, right, the TFL is actually an internal hip rotator. So this short muscle right here is in charge of rotating your hip inward, right? Now, when I go into a squat position, if my hip internally rotates, if I squat, like I'm going to do normal on my left, and I'm going to internally rotate my right. If I do this, right, you'll notice naturally my foot kind of wants to turn this way in response, because it's trying to find a way to sort of compensate for that movement. So that's why this is one of our overactive muscles, right? The biceps femoris is this hamstring muscle back here on the outside lateral part of my hamstring. So it's the outside, so it's the lateral hamstring muscle, right, away from the midline. And it's in charge of moving my foot like this. It squeezes. You can actually, if you put your hand under your thigh, you'll actually feel your your biceps femoris squeeze when you rotate your foot like this. So again, if my knee is caving in like this, you can see my foot is turning out like that. And then the lateral gastrocnemius is that outside calf muscle, which obviously pulls to the outside. And that's what he's going to kind of go through right here.
And the TFL. Now let's identify those muscles. If you wouldn't mind turning around for me. So whenever we look at the overactive muscles here, when the feet turn out, the overactive muscles, or the muscles which are doing too much, can be identified as the lateral gastrocnemius. Now the lateral gastroc is positioned here. We have the lateral and the medial head. When we look at the gastrocnemius, it crosses both the ankle and the knee. And whenever the knee is slightly bent, so go ahead and come into a small squat there, what we see is that lateral gastrocnemius can help to externally rotate the tibia, which is turning the feet out. In addition, we have the short head of the biceps femoris, which is positioned here. It attaches out to the fibular head and comes up about 1/3 of the way up the thigh. And again, as we go into this squat, if it's overactive, it can turn the foot out and go ahead and stand. And if we could turn and face back towards the camera. In addition, one that's oftentimes left out is the TFL. Now the TFL sits up here near the hip, but what we need to understand is that it attaches to the IT band, and that IT band comes all the way down here and attaches to the front part of the tibia. So if any of those muscles are overactive, which simply means they're doing more than they should, whenever we squat, it will start to turn the feet out. Now the underactive muscles, the muscles that are normally not doing their job, are usually just on the other side of the joint. So with that, we would see the medial gastrocnemius. If you could go ahead and spin around for me again. The medial gastrocnemius is going to be here on the inside. So it's the other side of the joint in the transverse plane with the knee rotation. We can also see the medial side of the hamstring becoming underactive, and the glutes can also become underactive. You can go ahead and spin around again. So whenever we see the feet turn out, the areas we would need to foam roll and stretch would be the lateral gastroc, the short head of the biceps femoris, and the TFL. The areas we would need to activate would be the medial gastroc, the medial hamstrings, and the glutes.
So he just identified like what muscles you need to strengthen and what muscles you need to stretch out, right? And it's because all of those are the muscles that have that altered length tension relationship. And that's going to be what the rest of this course is. We got one more day where we're going to look at some more anatomy and movement stuff. But we're also going to start looking at our posture alterations on Monday. And then we'll have our midterm on Tuesday. Then on Wednesday, we're going to really start going through all of the assessments that are in your NASM textbook. And we're going to talk about like what it means if your foot's, turning out. We'll talk about how to stretch those muscles, how to strengthen those muscles, how to get everything back to an ideal length tension relationship. Because when we see alterations in posture, they have altered length tension relationships. So that's where we're headed. Do you guys have any questions? Are we feeling good for the weekend? Well, heck, guys, that's all I got for you today. I'm going to go ahead and let you all out of here. And yeah, see you on Monday.
I like those NASM videos. It's just, I give that girl a lot of credit to be put on the spot like that and on a national video,
Right? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's funny. There's like, they seem really chummy. Like it's got to be like, somebody who works at NA. She's probably like on the sales team or something. Because they seem really chummy in the other videos. Like it's like they clearly know each other. Or maybe it's like just a client, All right, guys. See you on